Well, good evening. This is lesson number 4 of the How to Play Musket and Pike series by GMT Games. And we've covered a lot of ground in the first 3 lessons. Tonight I'm going to branch out into some new ground that we haven't really talked about and try to cover some of the odds and ends in the system. And mostly what we're going to talk about tonight is reactions and what those all involve. We'll talk a little bit more about morale, and that should get us pretty close to understanding the whole game system. So, reactions. Basically what reactions are is reactions allow the inactive player to take limited actions of their own while in a response, that is, to activities that active units are undergoing. So when an active unit is doing certain things, it can provoke certain forms of reaction on the other player's part. And we've seen a little bit of that so far, but I haven't really explained all of them. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. First of all, a few restrictions. A given unit, when it comes to reactions, a given unit can react, they can perform one type of reaction per trigger. And we'll talk about what will trigger those things, but if in certain actions that a player will do, it could produce multiple triggers, and or that single action could trigger multiple different types of reaction, but you can only do one of them. For example, moving adjacent to an enemy unit, that can trigger a reaction move. It could trigger an interception under the right circumstances. It could also trigger reaction fire. So if you have a trigger that causes all of, potentially any one of those 3 things, you can only do one of them. You can't do all of them. A single triggering event enables any and all eligible inactive units to take a reaction. And reactions are sequential. So let's say, for example, that these dragoons over here on the royalist side of the battlefield, on the left-hand side, let's say I move them up. They're under charge orders, so they can move adjacent to enemy units. Now I've moved into a reaction zone of both of the parliamentary dragoons there by the plowed field. What I can do with this, there's a couple different things that the reaction player could do. There could be a reaction move, it could be a reaction fire. You can observe what one reaction does before committing to another. So you don't have to pre-designate in advance all the reactions that you're going to undergo when a trigger occurs. You can see what the result of one before you do another. That comes into play most often when it comes to interceptions. And we'll talk about interceptions in just a moment, but interceptions is one of those cases where you're really going to watch and see maybe what one reaction interception does before you commit any of your other eligible units to that type of reaction. Unit can react even if they're adjacent to an enemy unit. So, for example, and this is where the game is again going to depart from the Great Battles of History. There's a lot of similarities between the GBOH system and Musket and Pike, but this is one of those cases where it's really different and it's easy to port rules from GBOH over to this game that are not intended. Here's another example. We'll take this dragoon and we'll march him next to the 2 opposing dragoons. Now in GBOH, if you're already in a zone of control, you can't reaction fire. There's all kinds of restrictions on that. Not in this system. So even though the dragoon, and I'll put a marker on him so that you can see what I'm talking about here. Let's see. Okay, even though this unit here, I just put a bypass marker next to, on top of one of the parliamentary dragoons. Even though that guy is adjacent to a unit when the move occurs, when the trigger occurs, he can still perform a reaction. It's a really important detail. And so whenever you move into a line like that, you're probably going to undergo 2 reaction fires, one from each of those guys that you're moving adjacent to. So you have to think about those things in this game system. Unit may react even if they're adjacent to an enemy unit. We just talked about that. Reactions are not subject to orders restrictions. This is going to come into play big time when it comes to interception. When you are under any orders other than charge, you cannot under ordinary circumstances, move adjacent to an enemy unit. Well, that's not true when it comes to a reaction, especially the intercept reaction. So the intercept reaction does allow the inactive unit to move adjacent to an enemy piece, even though their orders would otherwise normally prohibit that. So be aware of that. Morale broken units. Units that are in a state of morale broken, they may not conduct any reactions, interceptions. They're incapable of doing any of that stuff. An out-of-command unit may react. So you do look at command right before reaction takes place. And that's something you can just briefly look at. Ordinarily, in most cases, it's not going to be a big deal, but in some cases it may matter because an out-of-command unit can react, but may not reaction move adjacent to an enemy unit in the course of that reaction. So if you've got a cavalry unit that's sitting out of command, like say this guy here, okay, I just moved the Balfour Cavalry Battalion to a state where he's out of command. Say he gets an appropriate trigger for a intercept. If he's out of command, he would not be able to do that because he is out of command at that instance. So another good reason to keep your units in command, because that being out of command does curtail some of the things you would otherwise be able to do reactively. All right, so those are the blanket restrictions on reactions. Now let's talk about reaction zones, because it's going to be different. There's different reaction zones based on the unit type and the type of reaction that you want to do. First of all, the reaction zone we've talked about, I think most, is the reaction zone for reaction fire on the part of artillery. Artillery may reaction fire into any space in its cone of fire up to a distance equaling its grazing fire range, which is, remember, on the artillery pieces, the first number on the bottom there. For example, the 3-pounder Falconer I just moved here. You'll see that piece has a morale of 5. It's got a grazing fire range of 3 and a max range of 9. So that particular unit could basically, they would be able to reaction fire anywhere within this particular zone that I am placing salvo markers in to mark. So this is the reaction fire zone for that artillery piece. Any enemy unit enters into those, conducts any movement into, retreat into, etc., that would be its zone of reaction. So for ordinary units other than artillery, I should say just non-artillery units, their reaction zone consists of, or at least for reaction fire anyways, reaction fire for non-artillery is the all of its flank and frontal hexes. Rear hexes are not included in that. Here's an example for a 2-hex unit. Its reaction zone, I just moved one here out into the front lines, and I'll zoom in for the benefit of those watching by video. This would constitute the reaction fire zone for the Essex 1 battalion. So anything that moves within that area, that is the zone for reaction fire for that non-artillery piece. So that's the reaction zone that you're going to encounter probably most commonly in the entire system. The other reaction zone you have deals with interceptions, and we'll talk about that when we get to interceptions. It's a whole other thing. Eligible units may conduct reaction moves when an enemy unit enters a particular hex, enters a hex that's particular to the type of reaction movement desired. It's harder to pin down a reaction zone for reaction moves. It depends on the type of reaction move you want to do. So I'm going to talk about those when we talk about reaction movement. All right, so let's talk about what constitutes a trigger. Trigger, an active unit. Whenever an active unit enters a hex in the inactive unit's reaction zone by normal movement or by advancing fire, which is when you move one hex forward and you conduct a fire, that's basically one action. So when you do an advancing fire, the active unit would fire first, and then that would provide a reaction trigger. Also, a retreating fire, which is the opposite of advancing fire. That's when you fire and then you back up. That may also constitute a trigger. Whenever an active unit enters a hex in an inactive unit's reaction zone by normal movement, advancing or retreating fire, cavalry avoidance of artillery fire, which we haven't talked about. I'm going to get to that later tonight. Whenever that happens, that would constitute a trigger for some sort of reaction. Whenever an active unit ends in advance after combat, or a retreat as a result of combat, or a pursuit as a result of combat, and they end that in an inactive unit's reaction zone, that can constitute a trigger. Usually that zone is going to be adjacent to the enemy piece, but with Interception, it's going to be within 4 hexes of the cavalry unit, and there's some more restrictions involved there we'll talk about in just a moment. Another trigger is whenever an active unit changes facing in an inactive unit's reaction zone. So even doing a facing change can constitute a trigger. So if I've got this cavalry guy and he's sitting here in front of this cannon, the artillery piece, if he changes his facing, that would be enough to constitute a trigger. So watch out for that. And whenever an active stack changes stacking order, that can be a trigger. Stacking order is important for a number of cases. It's not as important when it comes to stacking cavalry with dragoons or commanded muskets, but it is important really when you're stacking artillery with heavy infantry or light infantry for that matter. Artillery can stack freely with a heavy infantry, light infantry, or cavalry unit. I want to say you can stack 2 artillery pieces together, but the big deal is only the top one gets to fire or do any combat. So let's imagine for a moment if we took this heavy infantry brigade and we put the 3-pounder cannon on top. That artillery piece on top would then be able to fire either reactively or actively. However, if this piece, let's say this piece here, let's move him up forward so you can see this better. All right, so we put the artillery in front on top there. Let's say this cavalry piece moves here. When he does that, only the artillery would be able to do a reaction, would be able to actually fire. So only the top guy in a stack gets to shoot. That's really an important deal. One of the things you can do reactively that I should point out here is you can change the order of stacking instead of firing. So instead of firing what the artillery piece, what you could do is put the artillery piece in the bottom of the stack, bring the heavy infantry to the top of the stack. That would be the only reaction they could do here, but at least they would be positioned for the heavy infantry to pour musketry fire, which is far more deadly than artillery fire in this game system. So now, anytime you do that change of stacking, let's say that this guy did this as the active player. Say that the Meldrum heavy infantry battalion, let's say they went ahead and changed stacking and they were the active player. Well, then the Digby cavalry piece there would actually be able to reactively fire or conduct some other sort of reaction in a response to that changing of stacking. So if you change stacking as your action, that can trigger a reaction. That's one of those things that you have to really be careful about when you're setting up, because a lot of the scenarios will give you the freedom of placing your artillery. I don't believe this is one of those scenarios, but several of them, and especially in the newer games in the system, give you some freedom as to where to place your artillery. And just be aware that if they're alone and the enemy gets close to them, then the artillery piece is going to get overrun, and it's going to cost you VPs at the end of the game. If you stack them with infantry for protection, the infantry can protect them, but whoever's on top of the stack is the one that gets to fire, and you have to make up your mind at some point how you're going to position those. All right, let's see, is that all the triggers? Oh, here's another one. Whenever an active unit performs a rally or a reform action, for example, you'll see this dragoon here over on the parliamentary right-hand side of the line by the plowed field. You'll notice that he's in a formation state of formation shaken, which is designated by the FS on the counter. And then he is also morale shaken, so he's taken a morale hit and a formation hit. You can resolve that. You can restore the formation by doing a reform action instead of its movement. But if you do that, that can constitute a trigger. You know, if you do that within a reaction zone. If you do a rally action, that can also trigger, serve as a trigger. So be aware that reactions and rallies, or excuse me, reforming and rallying can constitute a trigger if done in a unit's reaction zone. Lastly, whenever an active unit performs any type of fire on the inactive unit, then that constitutes a trigger. Now this is another important detail. Let me get rid of this counter here. Let's say that this particular Dragoon here in the middle by the plowed field, the Royalist guy, I just put him kind of off-center in his hex. Let's say that he fires on this particular Dragoon here. So that's his target. He shoots. Now he's shooting, and he's in the reaction zone of the non-target Dragoon that is adjacent to him. If he does that, just conducting that musketry fire, only the target of the musketry fire or the pistol fire can return fire. So whenever you do a fire action, only the target gets to do reaction, even though you may be in the reactive zone of another unit. That's a really important detail. So if you move next to them, both guys get to react, but if you're doing just musketry fire, only the target gets to react. Alright, so those are the triggers. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here, and when we start the next segment, we'll talk about what the different types of reactions are. There's several different types of reaction movement. There's interception, and then there's reaction fire. We've seen a little bit of this, but now I'll explain the rules entailed in this. Let's talk a little bit now about the different types of reaction. There's reaction movement, there's interception, and then there's reaction fire. Reaction movement, this is something we haven't seen a whole lot of, so let's go ahead and cover this. There are basically three different types of reaction movement. You have the reaction movement called facing change. That's when you change the facing of the reaction unit's piece in response to enemy movement. You can form a hedgehog, heavy infantry only. Cavalry, of course, don't do that, nor do light infantry, but heavy infantry, they're equipped with pikemen, and so they can form a hedgehog, which is a very strong defensive formation. It's very difficult to attack in close combat, but it's highly vulnerable to fire combat. So you can do that reactively. Heavy infantry, as you can imagine, are vulnerable from the flank and from the rear, and cavalry generally don't like to charge into the reaction fire zones of heavy infantry because they get shot to smithereens. But if you attack them from the rear or the flank, you have a much better chance of survival, especially from the rear, and so you can force a reaction on the opponent to form a hedgehog formation. Third type of reaction movement is what's called withdraw. And you encounter this mostly with cavalry moving reactively in response to a heavy infantry movement. So let's look at facing change first. If an enemy unit with a movement rating that's less than or equal to the reacting unit's movement point value, if they move adjacent to the reacting unit's flank or rear, the reacting unit may change facing. Here's an example of this. Let's say that this particular cavalry, the guy that's already formation shaken here, the Carnarvon, let's say he moves forward into hex, what is that, 2109? Excuse me, 2119. 2019, excuse me. When he moves into this hex, adjacent to the Dragoons, those Dragoons, that movement was in his reaction zone, so the Dragoon that he's adjacent to, he has a movement rating of 6. He's light infantry. Now the Carnarvon cavalry, because he's formation shaken, has a movement rating of 4. So because his movement, the active unit's movement rating is less than or equal to the reaction unit's movement rating, then what can happen is the Dragoon can change his facing by up to 2 vertices. And this, it's in his flank hex. So if he moved into this hex, there would be no opportunity for facing change because it's the frontal hex of the target. But since he's in the flank of the target, even though he's already adjacent to another guy, he can change his facing by 1 or 2 vertices as he desires. That's going to be most useful, you know, with cavalry reacting to another cavalry move. Whenever you're trying to get a flank attack on somebody or a rear attack on somebody, that's where you'd want to do that. 2 hex units. Now this is unusual. A lot of game systems wouldn't have this, but let's say this Carnarvon guy. Let's say he moves into this hex here. There's a couple opportunities here for the heavy infantry brigade. Meldrum could do one of 2 things. He could reaction fire. Now it's in the flank hex, so he's got to roll a little bit higher to score any hits. And that would probably be a better choice, but maybe there's other considerations at play. Maybe he sees there's other cavalry that are yet to move, and he wants to do something to set up a better opportunity defensively later in the turn. What he can do is he can actually do a reaction move, because Meldrum has a movement rating of 4, and the active unit has a movement rating of 4, he does have the opportunity to do a facing change. A 2 hex unit may pivot half the counter up to 2 hexes. So he could actually, this is an extreme case, but he could actually swing his whole counter around, and I'll put a hedgehog counter here to show you that the left-hand side of Meldrum's counter entered this hex, and then entered the final hex that you see it in here, as a part of that reaction. Now here's the catch with this though. You got to be careful with this, because a 2x unit may pivot half the counter, but new hexes that the half the counter enters may not be adjacent to an enemy unit unless the unit that's doing the reaction is under charge orders. Now you may always pivot if the pivoting unit's stationary hex is already adjacent to an enemy, and the pivoting half does not move adjacent to any other enemy unit. So this particular move that we have here, that would be perfectly legal. However, let me put him back how he was. If, let's say, Digby was located here, no reaction facing change would be allowed unless Meldrum's wing was under charge orders, because any pivoting, whoops, selected the wrong unit. Any pivoting of Meldrum would bring the other half of the unit adjacent to the non-moving piece, Digby, and that would be considered illegal. So, at least as far as a reaction move would be concerned. So, if Digby was here, let's say Digby was located right here, Meldrum could reaction, face change like so, but it could not. I'm trying to get him back where he was. Good grief. All right. I could reaction move him like this, but I could not bring him around a second hex, because that would bring him adjacent to Digby again. So once again, that is reaction face changing. You're not going to encounter, I don't see that happening as much with the 2x units. You're going to find it happening more so with the 1x units. With the 2x units, there's usually not enough room to maneuver to do any shenanigans, but the option is available to you, and sometimes you'll find it useful to avail yourself of that. All right, let me put everybody back where they were. Okay, let's talk about the second reaction move, and it's not really a move per se as much as it is a changing of formation. I'm going to go ahead and bring Meldrum up forward. Let's say he's in this the absurd position here, and remember that Lord Wilmot is under charge orders, so the Royalist Cavalry, Royalist Cavalry, Carnarvon, let's say he activates, he must charge and move adjacent to the nearest enemy unit that does not already have one of his own guys already adjacent to him. So he can't target this Dragoon here because he's already got somebody adjacent to him. This guy is too far away. He's 3 hexes away. That makes Meldrum the target. Now, he's got a couple of options. He can move here. That would bring him adjacent. And he could continue to move. But that would constitute a trigger for Meldrum perhaps to reaction fire on him. And he doesn't want to give them that chance. So what he might do is he might go 1, 2. Now, as soon as he moves adjacent like that, that's going to cause a trigger. So maybe it'd be better to go 1, and then face change 2, and then 3. That sets up a good attack. Now, when he does this, as soon as you move into either the flank or the rear hex of a heavy infantry unit, that heavy infantry unit has the opportunity then to reaction to form Hedgehog. Now, if you move adjacent to the flank, the opportunity to form Hedgehog is optional. Okay, so if the enemy unit moves in the flank, you may choose to try to form Hedgehog, or you may choose not to. You're not compelled to do that. If you choose to try to form Hedgehog, you must dice for it. You have to make a morale check. And so Meldrum's got a morale of 7, and on the 10-sided die, with 9 being the highest, it's pretty good odds you're going to pass that morale check. Now, if you move into the flank of a unit, of a heavy infantry unit, it must attempt to form Hedgehog. So they don't have the opportunity for any other reaction there. They have to try to form the Hedgehog. So in this case here, he would have to roll a die, and if he rolls a 7 or less, he's good, and his formation would form a Hedgehog. If he rolls higher than 7, then that would constitute a failure of the morale check, and instead of forming Hedgehog, he would take a morale hit. Something I should mention about heavy cavalry, and this is kind of off topic, it has to do more with close combat, but heavy cavalry have their strength value. Well, actually, I should say the target heavy infantry units have their strength value halved when they're attacked solely by cavalry units. So whenever, this cavalry unit's got a strength rating of 3 against 18, that's not very good odds. But when it's cavalry attacking heavy infantry alone, the strength value of the heavy infantry is halved. So it'd really be 3 versus 9, which is a lot more manageable. You get several cavalry ganging up on this guy, and they could potentially chew him up. Usually it's best to try to attack infantry that's been bludgeoned and beaten up by your own infantry rather than to take on fresh heavy infantry, even from the flank or the rear. Alright, so that's form Hedgehog. And by the way, that's a very valid tactic of just simply moving adjacent to the rear of a heavy infantry unit to force that morale check. Because if you damage their morale, that sets up a much better opportunity. And if they're already morale shaken, well, shoot, that causes them to be morale broken, and that means they're pretty much dead meat to your cavalry. So that's a very valid tactic to simply move into the rear of heavy infantry to force that morale check. Okay, so I'll put everybody back here. Last form of reaction movement is withdraw. And here's where that comes into play. Let's reverse the situation. Let's say that Meldrum, let's pretend they're under charge orders, and Meldrum starts moving towards Carnarvon. If an enemy unit with a current movement allowance less than or equal to the inactive unit, their movement allowance, moves within 2 hexes, you basically pause the active unit's movement, and the inactive unit may use up to all of its available movement allowance to move away from the triggering unit. So if you choose to withdraw as a form of reaction, you must end up further away from the approaching enemy unit than you were at the start of the reaction. So as soon as Meldrum moves here, Carnarvon has the opportunity then to do a withdraw movement. And he's got 4 movement points to work with, so he could just go like this. 1, 2, and then 3, 4, at which point Meldrum would then be able to continue his march. So that is how a withdrawal works, and that's most commonly done with cavalry just trying to get away from heavy infantry. Now, there's a couple restrictions. You may only do this once per enemy activation. So, let's say Meldrum moves here. I'm going to reaction, withdraw. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. Say I don't want to get too far away. I'm moving 3 there. Okay, now Meldrum continues to move. That's another trigger, but he cannot do any more withdrawing during Meldrum's activation. So, if you're going to withdraw, do it right, because you only get 1 shot per activation. That's per activation, not per wing activation. If another unit is then activated within that wing and approaches him, you could withdraw again, but you can only withdraw once per active unit. Now, in order to withdraw, there's a couple of other restrictions. You have to, first of all, be under rally orders, or you have to be a leader all by himself in a hex, or you have to be a cavalry unit not under charge orders approached by heavy infantry. So in our current situation here with Lord Wilmot being under charge orders, that would actually not be allowed by us. So if you're under charge orders, be aware that if you're in the path of heavy infantry, it could get ugly really fast, because heavy infantry will chew your cavalry up if you don't withdraw. So watch out for that. All right, so that is reaction movement. Let's talk about interception. This is the biggie. This is where cavalry can really curtail the movement of active units. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording here, and when we come back, we'll talk about interception. Okay, so here's how interception is going to work. Let's set up this particular situation here. Let's say Lord Wilmot is done for the turn. Well, no, actually, I think we've got cavalry. Yeah, we got cavalry up there. Okay, let's say it's the start of turn 2 here. So let's say Lord Wilmot is active here. He's under charge orders. We'll go ahead and start here by moving Carnarvon, which has to move closer to to an enemy unit that's not already got a friendly unit adjacent to him. So his target can either be this hex here with Fairfield, or it can be this Dragoon, or it can be Meldrum. Obviously, he doesn't want to charge into the front of Meldrum, but it's a good thing he's not located here, because he would have to charge into Meldrum, and that would be ugly. So what he's going to do instead is this guy here, I think I said his name wrong, Fielding, excuse me. Fielding's hex actually would be invalid because he has no line of sight to him. So technically, he doesn't even know that they exist. So he would actually charge into here. This is going to be his target. So he's going to move 1, and then he can move 2. Now, there's a reason why you want to move 2 hexes before charging into combat. Is you can get a bonus in combat called momentum. And we might have showed that a little bit in lesson 3 here. But here's a big thing that can cause you to lose momentum, and that is if you are intercepted by an inactive unit. Now, as soon as he moves into this hex here, into hex, what is it, 1918, as soon as he moves into that hex, he has triggers the opportunity for a reaction in interception by the Fielding cavalry piece, which is located in hex 1920. So here's how this works. To intercept, you have to look at your charts. First of all, let me talk about eligibility. Let's just go through this, and then we'll play this situation out. First of all, whenever an enemy unit executes a movement activity within 4 hexes of the inactive unit, of the cavalry unit, and only cavalry get to intercept, by the way. Heavy infantry, light infantry, dragoons, all that, they don't get to intercept. Only heavy cavalry get to do that. Okay, if an enemy unit executes a movement activity within 4 hexes of the cavalry, and the enemy unit is in an inactive unit's front or flank arcs, excuse me. Let me show you how this works. The arc basically starts on both flanks of the cavalry piece, and it swings all the way around the piece. So where you see the salvo markers here, that's basically the arc. So stretching out 4 hexes from either side, as far out as 1, 2, 3, 4 to the unit's left, and then off the edge of the board on its right. That would constitute its reaction, its intercept zone. So if you can imagine, let me bring this piece here. Basically, I've just created a huge boundary. Everywhere bounded by these salvo markers would constitute the interception zone for the Fielding cavalry piece. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all those. All right, so the enemy unit has to execute a movement activity. Can't be fire, can't be rally, reform. It's got to be a movement activity, a facing change, entering a new hex. It's got to be within 4 hexes. It's got to be in the inactive unit's front or flank arcs. The cavalry unit that's intercepting may not be formation broken or morale broken. When you're morale broken, you have no facing, so you have no arc of intercept. That's basically the idea there. The cavalry must have a clear line of sight to the moving unit, so that's why he could not intercept here, even though it's in his zone. Well, he might have been able to. Let me draw a thread. Actually, that would be a trigger point. So, in fact, that would be a better place to test this. So as soon as he moves into this hex, it actually is in his... oh, come on. As soon as he enters hex 2018, that would be an eligible spot for Fielding to attempt the intercept. I'll go ahead and put him on top of the stack so we can see him. All right, so you have to have a line of sight to him. If you're dealing with slopes, remember you can have that dead ground or blind hexes that you can't see. If there's any blind hexes in between, you can't intercept. You have to be able to see every intervening hex you're going to move into to reach the target. The cavalry unit must have enough movement points to move to a hex adjacent to the target, and it cannot be formation broken before it's adjacent to the target. The intercepting unit, the cavalry unit, may not have attempted interception already during the current enemy wing activation. So what's going to happen is, whether he succeeds in his intercept attempt or not, he's going to get marked with interception done at the end of it, meaning he can't do any more intercepting attempts for the rest of the wing activation. And the movement allowance of the cavalry unit must be greater than or equal to that of the moving unit. So if you have a formation shaken cavalry and a fresh cavalry is moving within the zone, he may not attempt any interception because his movement rating is less than the target's. Alright, so if you have all of those ducks lined up in a row, then what you do is you pause the movement of the active unit. Don't forget how many movement points it's spent up to that point. If you're playing the physical copy of the game, it's sometimes helpful to leave one of the dice up on the table with the numbers showing how many movement points the cavalry piece has spent before you work on the resolving the interception. Oh, and an interception may not be intercepted itself. There's no counter interception. Otherwise, you end up in these endless loops. So there's no counter interception. So we pause this, and then we attempt the interception. To do this, there is a table. It's on the inside fold of the system charts, right below the terrain effects chart. It says Interception Table 9.3, Cavalry Units Only. You cross-index the current order that the reaction unit's under, and then you look at the die roll range necessary. You roll a die and you modify it according to certain modifiers. Fielding is a cavalry piece under received charge orders, so the die range is a 0 to 3 will result in a success. By the way, you'll notice that under rally orders, no interception is even possible. So rally orders are really nasty to be stuck under. Remember, if you're under rally orders, your leader, the wing commander, can't roll for continuation, can't preempt. Your cavalry units can't intercept. When you can't intercept with your cavalry, that makes you very vulnerable because it means the enemy can move with impunity around you. Just the ability to perform an interception serves as a check on the freedom of movement of enemy cavalry units, and that in itself is a very important weapon. Alright, so under received charge orders, we got to roll a 0 to 3, so we got a 40% chance of success, but the modifiers are this. -1 if you have an original morale of 8. Well, Fielding's got a morale of 6. Remember, that's the number in the red box. If the original morale is 6 or less, there's a +1 modifier. However, if the army commander or wing commanders stacked with the cavalry unit, then you can apply that rating. So let's go ahead and look at Fielding. I thought he had a rating on him. He does, but it's a 0, so he's not going to help us at all. Alright, so it's going to be basically a 30% chance. So he dices and he rolls a 7, and that is a failure. So when he fails, he gets marked with interception done. So when Carnarvon moves into here, that's within the reaction, the intercept zone of Fielding, but Fielding's already marked. He can't try again. However, when he moves into hex 1918, you'll see that the Balfour cavalry unit, which is under the command of the Balfour wing commander from the central formation on the Parliament side, he is 4 hexes away, and Carnarvon is in his line of sight. It constitutes a valid trigger for interception. Now this time, he's got a morale. Balfour's got a morale of 7, so there's not going to be any negative modifier, but he still has to roll a 0 to 3. He rolls a d10, and he rolls a 4 and just misses. So now, if Balfour was actually stacked with the Balfour cavalry piece, then his -1 would apply, and that would have been a success, and he would have been able to intercept. So as it is, he fails as well, and he gets marked with interception done. Okay, and because he moved 2 hexes, Carnarvon is eligible for the momentum advantage. So, and in fact, let me just confirm that, because it is a plowed field, but there's no, I don't think that applies. I don't think it does anything here. It's got to be through clear terrain into combat. You know what? I think since it's plowed field doesn't have any, it doesn't have any extra cost, but it's not clear terrain either, so I think it does take away the momentum advantage. So. Now, just for grins, let's imagine for a moment that the Balfour interception attempt succeeded. What would happen at that point is if he rolled a 0 to 3, he would move reactively toward the target. So if you had a success in your interception attempt, the cavalry unit must move to contact the moving unit. Each hex entered must bring the cavalry unit closer to the target until it's adjacent, and as soon as it's adjacent, it must stop. So he can move up to his full movement allowance, but he can't go swinging around the flanks and attacking the rear. He has to move to contact, which means he's going to go 1. He could spend a movement point to change his facing to go like so. It'll be 2, 3, 4. Now he's still got 4 more movement points, but he has to stop because now he's adjacent, so he can't go swinging around the flank. As soon as he moves to contact, you end up with a unique situation in that the active unit is permitted to reaction pistol fire against the moving guy, or reaction fire against the movement. So once adjacent, the moving unit that triggered the reaction may reaction fire if it's a cavalry piece. So yeah, it would be pistol fire, huh? So Carnarvon does get a shot with his pistols, and he might as well go ahead and take it here. He rolls a d10, and a 6 is not going to be high enough because he's going to suffer a -1 because he's formation shaken, and so we have to set his pistols to 1 shot taken, and no effect. If there was an effect, then you take the casualty off of Balfour, and then the intercepting unit has the opportunity to pistol fire. And once he's done, if he chooses to pistol fire, then the intercepting unit has the option of engaging in close combat with the unit it intercepted, even though it's not the close combat segment of the activation phase here. So in a lot of cases, it makes sense to go ahead and do that, do that interception combat. So here, let's just say Balfour decides to go for it. Firing pistols would constitute a loss of momentum, and a momentum is going to give you a +2 advantage in combat. So Balfour is going to go ahead and not fire his pistols. He's going to go ahead and engage in close combat, and the modifiers basically line up like this. My chart's out here. They both have the same morale. Strength ratio, it's 4 strength points to 3, but that's not enough to give you a modifier. You have to have a 2-to-1 advantage or a 4-to-1 advantage in order to give you a die roll modifier. It's heavy cav on heavy cav, so the close combat matrix says there's no modifier. The defending cavalry can spend a pistol shot in order to provide a -1, so he goes ahead and does that. Sets his pistols now to 0. And at this point, Balfour can go ahead and fire his pistols as part of the close combat without causing loss of momentum. So he does that. All right, so the defending and attacking pistols cancel each other out, so we're still at a net 0. He's not attacking the flank. The attacker is not formation shaken, open order, or broken. Formation broken. But he does have cavalry momentum. So, go ahead and mark him with a momentum counter. It gives him a +2. And the defender is in a state of formation shaken, so that gives him a +1. So it's a net +3 when everything's said and done. We roll a d10. And this is where it gets scary in close combat, because even though you might have really good modifiers, you can always roll a 0. And I am especially good at this. So the 0 + 3 is going to be a 3, and the result on the close combat table is attacker morale shaken. So let's get rid of the momentum marker. And he becomes morale shaken, so his morale is going to drop down. And whenever you engage in close combat, you always take a formation hit at the end. So his formation is going to drop down, and the attacker must retreat 2 hexes. And the defender has the option to advance into the vacated hex. He's going to decline that because he is now formation broken, doesn't want to wind up next to the heavy infantry. So at the end of that, then he would be marked with interception done, and Carnarvon can continue to do what he wants to do. At this point, he has no movement to spend, he has no pistols to fire, so he's basically done. So that there is a good snapshot of interception and what it can do. It was kind of a freak result on the close combat, but it gives you an idea of just how careful you have to be when you're maneuvering in the presence of enemy cavalry, and how, as a defender in a given situation, you want to position your cavalry so as to serve as a check on the freedom of movement of the attacking forces. Okay, so that's interception. Reaction fire, I think we've shown that we've demonstrated reaction fire quite a bit so far, so I'll only just say this, that basically there's no limits on reaction fire. You can reaction fire every time a trigger is provided to you, with the exception of artillery. Remember, they can only fire once per turn. There's a -1 die roll modifier whenever you're doing a reaction fire versus moving cavalry. Artillery, remember, they must execute within the cone of their fire and grazing fire range. They can't already be marked as fired. So those are the limits to reaction fire. I want to wrap things up tonight by talking about morale. We talked about it a little bit last week, but let me give you a little bit more info on morale and its importance in the game. First, let me get rid of these interception markers. There's basically 3 morale states, as we said last week. There's morale normal, which is no marker, and then there's morale shaken, and then there's morale broken. Under normal morale, there's no effect. Your morale is what's printed on the counter. Shaken, when you're in a shaken state, the morale level on the counter is reduced by 1. That's the most notable effect. Here in the Vassal module, it automatically changes the morale value on the counter. So you'll notice that when Balfour became morale shaken, there's an MS marker put on the counter in Vassal, and then the 7 became a 6 in its morale box. So when you're shaken, your morale level is reduced by 1. If a shaken unit suffers a morale result that causes it to become shaken again, it instead becomes morale broken. If a morale shaken unit suffers a morale broken result, it's simply marked as morale broken. There's no additional effect beyond that. Broken. Morale broken is a big deal, and I'll show you by marking the dragoons here as morale broken. Let's just do that. Okay. When a unit becomes morale broken, let's just imagine for a minute that Carnarvon is going to attack in close combat. He's going to attack these dragoons. In close combat, we'd have an interesting situation here. So let me put the morale back as it was. Let's just work this out. Carnarvon is heavy cavalry. He's got a strength of 3 against 2 from the dragoons, so there's no strength modifier. But the morale differential is 7 to 5, so it's a +2. Close combat matrix, cuirassier against light infantry is a +2, so that puts you at +4 right there. However, the attacker is formation broken. That's a -2, so we're back to a +2. However, the defender is formation shaken, so that's a +1. It all nets out to +3. So let's go ahead and dice. And we'll dice until we get something that's going to bring about the situation I want to see. I need a 4 or 5. There we go. Let's say he rolls a 5. 5 and 3 is an 8. The result there is defender morale broken. So what would happen here is we drop the morale down by 1, and we retreat him 2 hexes. He's got to retreat toward his retreat edge of the board. All right. Here's what happens when you become morale broken. This is a formation state as well as a morale state. Your morale is reduced to 1. So you'll see that in Vassal here it changed the morale rating on the Dragoon counter to a 1. If a morale broken unit is marked as such, it can only move during the route movement phase. So even when his wing is activated, a morale broken unit can't do anything, can't perform any movement actions, can't do any firing actions. There's very, very little that a morale broken unit can do. Really the only thing it can do is attempt a rally. And that really depends also on the proximity of the wing commander, the army commander, and the orders that its wing is under. And I'll talk about that in just a second. If you're morale broken, you can't fire, you can't move except during the route movement phase. During the route movement phase, you move your maximum movement allowance toward your retreat edge. So light infantry, he's gonna book it 6 hexes towards his retreat edge, or 6 movement points towards his retreat edge. When you're doing that route movement, you can move adjacent to enemy units, although it's advisable to try to avoid that at all costs. However, you must try to move as much as it is possible. You're trying to move towards your retreat edge of the board and away from enemy units if you can avoid them. If you suffer any adverse morale result in combat, it will be eliminated. So that's nasty. Now, attacking a morale broken unit, here's what happens with it. There's no special modifiers. There doesn't need to be any special modifiers for attacking a morale broken unit, and here's why. The morale differential alone is usually enough to give you the +4 maximum die roll modifier on the close combat table. However, you can always roll a 0. And a 0 + 4 is a 4, and that's basically a negative result for the attacker. Negative results for the defender start at 5. So there's always a 10% chance that if you attack a morale broken unit, you could be repulsed. And that really stinks when it happens, but it still can happen. Nothing is ever certain in close combat. But if you do suffer any adverse morale results, for example, if you ended up with a morale shaken result on the close combat table, say you rolled a 1, that would mean defender morale shaken. You don't mark the piece as morale shaken. Instead, because it's morale broken, it gets destroyed. As soon as a unit becomes morale broken, doesn't matter how it happened, but when it occurs, it must immediately move 2 hexes away from whichever enemy unit caused that condition to be brought about. Usually that's going to happen with an enemy piece adjacent to you. It is possible that artillery can cause that a unit to become morale broken from a distance. Bottom line is you have to move 2 hexes further away from whichever enemy unit triggered the morale broken condition. Alright, morale checks. Morale checks are real simple. To do a morale check, whenever you're called to do a morale check, and we talked about this last week, you basically dice against the morale rating of the unit. If you roll less than or equal to the current morale, you're good. If you roll higher than, you take a morale hit. That includes whenever you're doing a reaction to form hedgehog. If you success in the morale check, you form a hedgehog. But if you fail, you don't form a hedgehog, and because you failed the morale check, you take a morale hit, which means your morale drops 1 level. Rally actions are basically the opposite of a morale hit. The idea behind a rally opportunity is to restore morale back 1 level toward normal. So here's how you can do this, and this is very important little details here. Basically, any in-command unit under rally orders, may conduct a rally action. So let's say it was Fielding's wing opportunity here to do an action. Under the current conditions here, the Dragoon is actually out of command. So he's morale broken, he's out of command in this location here. So he would not be able to do a rally activation, even if Fielding was under rally orders. So just for grins, let me change Fielding's orders so you can see this. There we go. Let's say Fielding was under rally orders. Right now, that Dragoon would not be able to do a rally action. Instead, what would happen is Fielding, for his one thing that he can do for his activation, he could move up to 8 movement points, but he has to end, if possible, stacked with somebody from his wing. He could move so as to stack himself with the Dragoons, and that would then bring the Dragoons under command. So that would allow the Dragoons then to undergo a rally. All right, so you got to be in command, and you got to be under rally orders if you want to rally. There is another condition that can cause you to be able to rally, and that is if this situation were brought about. Let's just imagine that this was the situation at the start of this wing's activation. All right, say Fielding's under receive charge orders, and he's positioned as so. The morale broken unit is adjacent to its wing commander, and his wing commander is under receive charge orders. If a unit is stacked with or adjacent to its wing commander, and the wing commander is under the whole wing is under receive charge orders, you may conduct a rally. So that's another way you can do that. If you are stacked, we get the Army commander here. Earl of Essex is the Army commander here for the parliamentarian side. If you are stacked with or adjacent to the Army commander, and the Army commander, as its sole action for that particular activation, that wing activation, decides to do a rally, he could rally that one unit. So one unit stacked with or adjacent to an Army commander may conduct a rally action. Here's the procedure. The procedure is just like a morale check. The success is automatic if you're stacked with your wing commander, or if you're stacked with the Army commander and the Army commander is doing his one action is to rally. If you're stacked with him and he does that, it's automatic success. You don't have to roll a morale check. However, if we had this situation like so, let's say this was the situation. Let's say the Earl of Essex is located right here, in between the broken Dragoons and and Balfour. Here's how this could happen. Right now, Balfour is, let's say Fielding is the active wing, and he wants to rally the Dragoons. What can happen here is because Fielding is not stacked with the Dragoons, the success is not automatic. And if Fielding takes as his single action for that activation to move so as to be stacked with the Dragoons, then the Dragoons can't rally because Fielding's got to do a special thing in order to rally. Unless the wing is under rally orders, that's the only time that you can actually move the leader into a position that's going to enhance the rally opportunity. So in this case, you don't want to move Fielding because that's going to screw things up. So if you're going to receive charge orders, you can't move the wing commander if you want to rally somebody that's stacked with him or adjacent to him. So what we can do here, though, is we can still dice for it. Right now, if you roll a 0 or 1, you have a success. But since the Earl of Essex is adjacent to the guy that's broken, Earl of Essex has a -1 modifier, and he's the Army commander, so his modifier is always going to apply. Go ahead and apply that here. So what can happen is we roll a die, we modify it by the Earl of Essex value, and if you get a final result of 0 to 1, that would rally the Dragoons. So we roll a die here, and we roll 0, so that would bring the Dragoons out of a morale broken state. Now, because Fielding is the active unit or active wing, Earl of Essex does get his opportunity to do his one thing, and his one thing, what he would want to do is try to rally Balfour, who he's adjacent to. But again, because he's not stacked with him, he's got a dice against the morale, but again, he can use his modifier -1. So rolling for Balfour, he's got better odds, but he rolled a 9. And 9 minus 1 is 8, still higher than his morale level. If you're attempting to rally and the die roll is greater than the rally attempt fails and the morale level is dropped by 1 again. So Balfour then goes morale broken and moves again 2 hexes towards his retreat edge. So that's what we call a catastrophic failure. Now, the guy that rallied, whenever you rally, you take the guy out of the morale broken state, he improves to morale shaken, and he goes to formation broken. So he becomes morale shaken, formation broken. If he's a cavalry unit, you never lose track of his pistol shots. You keep those counters on him until he reloads. So if you become broken, just keep the pistol counters with him, because whenever he rallies out of that state, he retains whatever pistols he had before he became morale broken. So, once you've rallied out of morale broken, remember, again, you improved to morale shaken, but the formation level drops to, or becomes formation broken. Because remember, morale broken is also a formation state. Terribly complex stuff there. Last thing I should say about this, Earl of Essex, because he's an army commander, let's say that fielding is then done for the turn. He's finished. Okay, well then when Balfour, the center wing, activates, Earl of Essex as his one thing for that wing activation, he could move so as to stack with Balfour. And then, let's say Balfour fails his continuation, he's finished. Now it becomes the wing activation for Ramsay. Okay, when he activates, then Earl of Essex, as his one thing, he could then rally Balfour, and he would basically take his formation broken. He becomes formation broken, and he becomes morale shaken. So he would rally out of that state. Oh, and when you rally, you may reface the unit. So Balfour, if he wished, could then be repositioned like so after the rally attempt. All right, and that is pretty much everything on morale. I think we'll do one more lesson next week, and the last thing we need to cover in some detail is close combat. We'll get into some of the wonky things that can happen in close combat and tie up any of the loose ends regarding artillery. Artillery are very vulnerable in close combat. We'll talk about how to handle all that stuff. So, thanks for coming out tonight, and we'll see you back next week for what should be the concluding lesson in the series.